Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod.
Well, I'm in a hotel room outside New York City. I'm at a 4-day-long pharma conference in the city, which is part of why my voice is so shot. One of my clients took a whole bunch of us out to a Brooklyn Nets game last night, and I'm operating on not enough sleep and getting my coffee on. My wife worries about me when I'm traveling. She is afraid I'll kill myself one night in a hotel. And I get where she's coming from. I am maybe not the cheeriest guy, and spending day after day being on with person after person in all these meetings can be it can be kind of taxing, I guess. And, you know, I tell people that at the end of the day, after a trade show, I will get back to the hotel room and just stare at the wall for a while until the echoing in my head goes down. But it's not that bad, you know. And it's, you know, other people have real jobs, as I've been putting it this week. And I got to say, I don't think I ever really considered ending my life on the road, at home, wherever. I know that sounds less than authoritative, but bear with me. See, this week's show, it's a conversation with Edith Hall, a classics professor and writer who has this amazing new book out from Yale University Press. It's called Facing Down the Furies: Suicide, the Ancient Greeks, and Me. And it's an examination of suicide and how it's been treated throughout history, especially in the pre-Christian era, you know, when eternal damnation wasn't really, you know, a thing. And Edith goes on from there to explore her own family's history with suicide. Her grandmother and her great-grandfather, her grandmother's dad, both killed themselves, and Edith had suicidal episodes herself in her youth. And in the book, she she turns her eye to the great Athenian tragedies and how they can help us understand suicide and suicidality, and how to save our loved ones from it, and how to make the argument that it's better to be here. And her book is just this masterful reading of those plays, blended with the archaeology of her own family history and memoiristic elements of her life and her troubled relationship with her mother, who was trying to keep this family curse from perpetuating. And there's two things to note about the family curse. Edith is named after her grandmother, and her grandmother's suicide occurred when Edith was like 3. And the shadow of that just hung over her mother and darkened their life together. And it's a beautiful and sad book, and it celebrates how we can continue to find reasons to live. And it, you know, despairs over the connections that we lose and what suicide means and does. And it reminds us that like 2,500 years ago, people were consumed with like the same issues that we have today, the same, we'll say, existential despair, just in terms of whether one should continue to exist. And those plays she cites, you know, she integrates them into the narrative. They're just as alive as they were back in ancient Athens when they were being staged. And she really just brings it all into this modern discussion of suicide and the thing is, this book also opened some wounds, or otherwise, you know, rocked my world. See, an hour before Edith and I recorded. I was texting with my brother about it, ostensibly to see about how to pronounce the name of Aeschylus's play, Alcestis, or Alcestis, as we will find out. But what I really wanted to do was broach whether it would be okay to mention my niece's suicidal episodes in the past few years. She's his daughter, and I dropped her a line earlier in the day to just, with a, hey, you around? I got something I want to ask you sort of way. I didn't want to just suddenly, hey, we haven't texted for a while, but is it okay to talk about you trying to kill yourself? I didn't hear back from her. So while corresponding with my brother about ancient Greek, I asked, and he said it would be okay. His daughter eventually did get back to me, and she wrote, oh, sure, give out my name, give out my social. I'm fine with talking about it. But it's a sign of, I'm very cautious, or I guess protective about it, and that's a sign of the taboo nature of this topic, which the whole point is we're trying to get around. But that was just a prelude here, because what really got to me was during that text exchange, my brother revealed that he'd been suicidal in recent years. And he told me it was fine to talk about this on the show. So I talked about it with Edith a little, and I'm going to talk here, I guess. I'm taking his word for it. But we were texting about this, and he told me how his inability to write a memorable suicide note really kept him from taking the plunge, along with a wife, 3 children, and all the responsibility that entails. It's the rights responsibility, as Edith puts it. That's sort of Aristotle's argument about how suicide doesn't affect just you. It's everybody you touch in your life, and what that means. But I was just floored. I had no idea that his despair ran that deep. And I know the strain of his daughter's suicidality and everything that fed into that was difficult for him and for his wife. But I don't know. I mean, we talked when he visited last December, and he sounded kind of bleak about the meaningless of things then. Like about teaching, and I was in but your students will remember you for years and years and years, and he just wrote that off, having taught these kids for more than 25 years now. And other aspects like faith he seemed just bereft. Not in a despairing mode, but we always have this sort of, I don't want to say guardedness. I don't know how to characterize our conversation, our friendship, our relationship, our brotherhood. But, I just never thought he had been thinking of ending it. We all have suicidal ideation, even if we won't cop to it, and that's part of this conversation today, too. Everybody has those thoughts for a second here or there. We just don't plan them out after that, and apparently he was. And he's my older brother. And I don't want to get into a whole hero worship thing, but I couldn't conceive of this. I was just walloped with the thought that he'd ever consider just giving it up and ending it. And a good friend of his did just that a few years ago with a gun. And my brother saw what a mess that left physically and emotionally. And I still don't know how I'd feel about going on myself in this world if he would come to that sort of conclusion, which is something. So anyway, after we had this text exchange, but before recording with Edith, I talked with my wife about all this and about a parent of mine who's kind of sort of talked about killing himself. And I just assured her I've never had those feelings, not like that. And this will sound terrible, but in that moment, I realized I wasn't lying to her. I don't think I've ever had a serious thought about killing myself. And that led to the contradiction, given Edith's exploration of suicide as a family curse, of making me even more uneasy as to why I hadn't. I mean, me being me, I started wondering if this meant that I'm too shallow and not being honest enough with my life to look deeply in and at the world and have to make the active decision to stay alive, instead of just sort of grinding along by inertia, just, seeing what the next day comes, or the next day brings, I mean. But I know that's overthinking things, I just think, for all my perceived dreariness and my resting bitch face and all that, I am maybe happy to be alive. And not just in a, can't wait to see what happens next way, but, I'm entranced by the world's that sense of unfolding that I talk about. The way the world keeps revealing itself in different ways, the way we always surprise ourselves, the way each of these conversations leads to a surprise. Now, I don't have the strains and stresses that my brother and his family had gone through. I know that, and I can change you, I guess. And I let death get to me. I grieve deeply. Don't let people go, but not in a life's not worth living anymore kind of way, For me, it's more just reveling in the lamentation, I guess. I mean, I carried my friend Tom Spurgeon's death around with me for like 3 years before I finally managed to come to terms with it. And it took another year before I could figure out how to tell you all about it in a monologue episode that I know nobody listened to, but that's okay. But I guess, I don't know, I guess the sense of sharing and communicating, talking and listening, that all keeps me coming back. But I know, man, I know I've never been tried like my brother has. I've never been driven mad by obscure gods like Heracles or beset like Job. I don't know how I'd react if things got really tough, but, I hope I'd stay. And trust me, I'm embarrassed to go on like this. A big part of me wants to keep all this stuff private, but Edith's point is that we need to talk more honestly about suicide to help work through everything that it presents. So, my niece tried to kill herself. My brother considered killing himself. My father has intimated that, life is not worth living. And my wife worries that my sitting in a hotel room listening to Nick Cave records is a sign that I'm, halfway there. But it's been about a week and a half since that conversation, the texts and then this talk with Edith, and I gotta say, I'm just glad to tell you I do not have that drive, seemingly. But I'll say one of the interesting contrasts that occurred to me, when my brother's, one of his reasons for not following through was that he couldn't write a suicide note worth, keeping. When I was afraid I was going to die, before I got my best bad news leukemia diagnosis, I had 10 days to think about how I'm going to be dead in 6 months because nobody told me, don't worry, you're going to go in there, they're going to give you okay news. And I wrote my obit in that time, along with a whole lot of other preparations and stuff. But I sat down and thought, what would I want remembered if my life was taken from me, as opposed to if I took my life away. I don't know what to make of all that. I'm sorry to have gone on like this as much as I have. Facing Down the Furies, it's just a fantastic book. It might get you and your loved ones, into a conversation that maybe we all avoid in our day-to-day lives, but really ought to be necessary. And Edith's writing is just fantastic. The the thought that she puts into, telling the family story, and that she puts into really analyzing these Greek tragedies and how they can speak to us today. This is a book that's going to stay with me for a long, long time. Now here's Edith's bio from the book. Edith Hall is a professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University. She is the author of more than 30 books, including Aristotle's Way, How Ancient Wisdom Can Change Your Life. She lives in Cambridgeshire, I'm mispronouncing that, in the UK. Her new book is Facing Down the Furies, Suicide, the Ancient Greeks, and Me. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Edith Hall.
I guess as a first question, where did Facing Down the Furies come from? I mean, you talk about it sort of feeding out of Aristotle's Way, but can you talk about what led you to make this?
Yes, it was a two-stage process, really. The first was that I did get quite a number of responses from engaged readers to Aristotle's Way, saying, well, look, this is all very well, but what you're recommending takes a great deal of emotional energy, a commitment to the project, and an ultimately optimistic sort of sense that things can get better. What about people with very severe depression, whether endogenous or reactive to bereavements, but that just will not go away? People who, simply can't get out of bed in the morning to clean their teeth. Everything, daily tasks, feels like an uphill, mountain climb every day. And I felt bad about that because I've been in that position. I've suffered from depression most of my life. It is certainly endogenous. And I thought, I had glossed over that. I hadn't been entirely honest. Perhaps I should address it. But that wasn't the immediate spur. What happened was my mother died in 2016 at the age of 90 of natural causes, though I think she may have deliberately hastened it, but she was dying anyway. And in 2022, I finally got a huge box of papers relating to her family, her birth family, her ancestors, her mother, her grandparents, photographs, papers, documents, certificates, marriage certificates, death certificates in some cases. And it was very apocalyptic moment for me because my mother had adamantly refused to talk about her childhood, her relationships with her own birth family, because I did know that there was a suicide question. Yeah. But it wasn't till I got the hold of these papers that I decided I really had to find out about it. And once I'd found out about it, a rather sad but ultimately redemptive shape started to take place in my mind. And I wanted people who suffered in depression or who have to look after people with depression to know about it.
How tough was it?
Yes, it was tough. But it was tough in the way that I had a very strong feeling that it had to be done.
Yeah.
And it's tough in a way that having a painful procedure medically for when you're pretty convinced that there will be massive relief at the end of it. So it felt tough, but all the time constructive. And anyway, it wasn't even, I didn't have a choice. I was overwhelmed by a curiosity to know. Humans have this. People who have been adopted have very often a raging curiosity to track everything down. I hadn't been adopted, but I had been kept completely in ignorance of everything that made my mother who she was by her. Sort of conspiracy of silence. So I felt a bit like Oedipus going on his trek to find out who he was and where he came from, because psychologically I was somebody who'd been divorced from her background.
Yeah. to that extent, what were you afraid of finding? A la Oedipus and what he ended up discovering.
Well, I was afraid of finding really what I found.
Yeah.
That these deaths were avoidable, I think, certainly with modern hindsight, mundane, banal, and caused by really alterable circumstances of one kind and another. Either people who had listened harder, looked after them better, or simple structures like, in my grandmother's case, patriarchy. Sure. It made me angry as much as anything, that these miserable lives need not have been as miserable as they were. And a combination of the dreadful taboo that has historically surrounded the topic of suicide, acute social pressures like terrible things that go on in war for competence, and the dreadful plight of women, I think actually almost worse in the bourgeoisie than in the working class, because working class women had to go out to work. They may not have wanted to, but they weren't confined to quarters, to their bedrooms in the same way as upper middle class women. So there was a lot of anger to work through, but also, and I tried to get this over, in many ways this book is a sort of posthumous love song to my mother.
Yeah.
I did not get on with her. We had several estrangements. It was all incredibly painful and difficult. I did not have what I would call a happy childhood. But I was never in doubt that I loved my mother, but intimacy was just impossible. True emotional intimacy was simply out of the question. And she was often not there when I needed her. And yet I came through this trek to realise just how heroically brave she had been, and how her spirit, not to be sucked into this dreadful whirlpool of gloom and despondency, but to build something better. And she did. And all four of her children, we're all now in our 50s and 60s, are alive and kicking. She was the one, and the phrase just came so hard into my head, who faced down the Furies. She stared them back full in the face, the Furies of ancestral curses, misery and deaths by violence, and would not give in. And that title just came to me out of almost nowhere during my travels in Scotland with my husband as we went to unpick the narrative.
Yeah, this is the second Furies-derived title book I've recorded with somebody about in the last 6 weeks. So
interesting. What
it feels like there's
one?
The Furies, a book by Elizabeth Flock about women who took matters into their own hands, whether it's killing an attacker, organizing a gang in India, or becoming a Kurdish freedom fighter in an all-women's brigade in Syria.
Isn't that interesting, though, that the terrible times that we're living in seem to make these fictional, mythical figures of revenge and memory, their memory, they keep the memories of terrible things that have happened and try to avenge them or perpetuate the cycles of violence. Isn't that interesting that metaphor is for our times?
Listen, Friday night at dinner, when people were discussing our upcoming presidential election, I said it's going to be the women who decide this. They're the ones in America who are going to, I assume, make a significant stand. And
well, they
I
did
hope.
Last time, didn't they? The margin was the women of Ohio over reproductive rights.
Right.
I'm
and
very
I think
happy. You might not want to put this in the podcast, but
please.
My children are young adults who follow Taylor Swift. Sort of obsessively, and good for her. She's already told everybody to get out to vote, for everybody who represents their views. She hasn't told them who to vote for this time. She's just said this right to vote was hard come by for women. Go out and do it.
Yeah, it's a different age, and that was the I want to say heartrending, even though that's such a cliche term. Aspect of reading this book is just everything you were saying, both about your great grandfather and your grandmother. the things we almost take for granted now that could be there to help.
Absolutely.
I guess.
Absolutely. There's some of the
yeah.
things aren't. I mean, there is still a massive stigma around suicide, and that was another reason why I've written this book. It's because I wanted a book that did not involve religion in it in any way. I'm a secular, fairly committed agnostic. I say committed in that I think that the best way to happiness is to try to work it out for ourselves and not refer to a higher authority. Yeah. There is a commitment to it as a worldview. And I find people either well up when I talk about it and tell me about how many sad suicides there've been in their family, and there almost always are, or they sort of run away as if I'm somehow polluted, and that by talking about it somehow it'll make more people do it. I mean, there is a very strong sense of that even now. So I'm delighted you've asked me on your podcast, because this will reach a lot of people.
I gotta say, I reached out to my brother because I wanted to ask if it was okay to talk about my niece and her suicidal ideation period. She didn't kill herself, but I said, is it okay to bring this up? Please, he said. Yeah. And he expanded on things in a way that an hour ago I learned about my brother's suicidal ideation, which I knew nothing about until bringing this subject up. So,
exactly. Well, I'm so grateful, and I will do as many interviews, newspaper reports, appearances as I possibly can, because for every one of them, I gave a talk in Harrogate last week, and sure enough, there was the queue of 10 people at the end wanting to just tell me their stories.
Yeah.
I can't, I'm not a shrink. Sorry, wasn't say that.
Please. That's okay. We go with accepted terms.
I'm not a psychiatrist. Yes. I'm not a psychotherapist. I have no specific training, but if I can just open up the conversation, and indeed these Greek tragedies I talk about they were so wise. There are so many clues in them about how not to do it, to look after a suicidal person. You don't leave them alone. You don't believe them when they suddenly say they've changed their mind. There is this wonderful script in the last play I talk about, the one that definitely helped to save my life when I was in my final year at university, is the most perfect script for talking someone down. So I wanted to share these amazing scripts, and I'm actually hoping that there'll be some collaborations between mental health experts and theatre people. I think there is actually a specific therapeutic use for these scripts.
Yeah. One of my past guests, who was a professor of mine back at college, has done something like this, but specifically with veterans in relation to the moral wound that they've undergone, and bringing in the Greek tragedies and helping them specifically. I'm going to mispronounce it as Ajax. Is it Ios?
No.
Okay.
Everybody in English language calls him Ajax, so we stick with Ajax. It's Ajax in Latin.
That's it.
I use throughout the book, completely a la carte, the name that will be least alienating to the reader. Right. So, I'm not going to call Jocasta Iocasti. Right? Everybody knows her as Jocasta. So I'm not. This is not a lecture on Greek pronunciation. This book. This is a please look after your loved ones and hold them close book.
Yeah, talk a little about that sense, because again, on one side, the book is, again, this opening up about your own family's history, but it's so integrated with the works that have meant the most to you over the course of your career. I would say your career, your entire life, the Greek tragedies, as well as Aristotle and some of the philosophers.
Yes. Well, I didn't know why I was so attracted to Greek tragedy at the time. It started when I was 16 and I started to learn Greek. I didn't know why, but these texts spoke to me as nothing had ever spoken to me before. I mean, I was brought up in a very strict Christian family. The Bible never spoke to me like this. Disney movies never spoke to me like this. Fairy tales never spoke to me like this. There was something about these nuclear families under the eye of their local, quite small communities. Very, very important, that chorus in there. Yeah. And how they are utterly, utterly wrecked when people do this. It's partly just children and husbands and parents and wives of the people who do it. But the chorus is often, a dependent. Like in Ajax's case, they're his regiment. They're the men he has personally brought over with him from Salamis to fight at Troy. And they're utterly devastated. And they say very importantly, we should have known. We should have taken better care of him. He did emit these distress signals. What were we doing leaving him alone? And these are incredibly constructive scripts for people to work with. And the particular suicide of middle-aged men who feel thoroughly devalued and humiliated, that is a very, very common modern suicide. One of the most vulnerable groups are middle-aged men who have been passed over one way or another, or who have been wives have left them. That they're one of the most vulnerable groups because men find it so much more difficult to ask for help and admit vulnerability. So there is great wisdom. These plays are written by people who knew about suicide quite clearly to me, but they did not have, because they're in the 5th century BCE, they did not have the 2 millennia long proscription, banning on suicide of the Christian churches and indeed the other great monotheisms. They didn't have to deal with that. Nobody said you're automatically going to hell and you're a sinner and you mustn't be buried in holy ground and those kinds of things. This was a Christian invention.
And still, there is the sense not of their own damnation, but of damning everyone around them, as you put it, that it destroys the fabric of the world. This is part of, this will again get back to my texting with my brother, the origin of which, by the way, was a Greek pronunciation question that ended up turning into this big suicide discussion. He's a teacher at and I'll bring up the play that I tried to not sound like a moron when I mentioned, but you start with sort of the philosophic rationale. The explanation of, it's what we owe each other that should keep us here. And I asked my brother with, the experiences with his kids, as well as the students that he has who are teenagers, does that help? Does it shame them even more in terms of now I'm going to let down everybody in my life. I have nothing to live for, et cetera. And he has said in his experience with the kids and with himself, there is that sense of, everyone else that this is going to hurt. And that it was able to pull him and some of these kids out of that mindset. But
it is a difficult one because you don't want to add to people's sense of worthlessness.
That's what I mean. Yeah, you're making them feel like they're failing everyone.
However, in practice, and I didn't write about this in the book because I'm not an expert, but I have talked to a lot of people who are trained suicidal person counsellors. And in practice, what's called the rights responsibilities argument is used. In practice, when you've got somebody who's come to you because they're feeling suicidal, in practice, they do very, very often say, have you thought about how that'll make your mother feel? Or have you thought about how that train driver will feel, who's a completely sort of innocent bystander, as it were. In practice, it does. And actually, for me, it was very important. I think the problem is with young people, especially ones who in any way find it difficult to talk to their own parents, as I did, you don't have a lot of people who are heavily dependent on you.
Yeah.
Now, I am very aware now, I've taught thousands of undergraduates. I've supervised and therefore become a vicarious parent to 40 or 50 graduate students. And I have brought up 3 of my own children. And I have many, many friends. And the blow to their morale, life is difficult enough as it is, without somebody who you admire, look up to, have been taught by, or see as some sort of parental exemplar. If they give up on it, right? Yeah. This is a massive responsibility. And there we have a duty, even if it's horrible, to go on living, to show other people that you can. Yeah. But when you're 22 years old and you've just had a romantic breakup, you don't seem to have any friends that you can talk to, and your mother puts the phone down, you ring her up because she's cross with you for something else, then that argument really doesn't. You can't imagine that it'll really hurt anyone else. So I think that the people with nobody dependent on them are A, the most likely to do it because they feel so isolated, but also B, they tend to be in the younger generation or these sort of middle-aged people I'm talking about, sort of men who've lost their marriages and children are acutely vulnerable, and that's statistically documentable. They think no one will care.
Right. And that's what I try to wrestle with. I said the argument, rationally, the argument holds up, but it's an irrational act, and that's, makes it so much more challenging to address. Again, never been in the position of having to talk someone through this, but I did have to allay my wife's concerns when I filled her in on the text exchange with my brother earlier, though, that trust me, don't worry, but Yeah.
No, but the answer to, the solution to a problem that something is a very difficult topic.
Yeah.
It's not to suppress it further.
Right.
That is not the solution. It means very careful handling and airing. And there are enormous and very valuable, I write about them in the book, I research them, very important and historically long-standing research projects in both California and New York in particular, by incredibly wonderful humanitarian experts in mental health. And we need to have that conversation in alliance with them.
Right. Yeah, I don't mean to make it I would say not make it such a heavy conversation, but obviously this is the heaviest subject around.
It is the heaviest subject around. Yeah. I mean, the point is that the human condition is mysterious and very often terrible. And very frustrating. And I go back to that point that it's you have a duty, if you're in any way depended on or an exemplar, not to go and make it much more difficult for other people to carry on in this waiting room for death.
Right. That was yesterday's conversation. I went to a seminar for my graduate school. I emailed you before this. Yeah, we did Montaigne, and that to philosophize is to learn how to die. And wrestled with the losing fear of death versus actively going at it. And, trying to get across to some of the people who maybe didn't read it as closely as I did, the difference in that in terms of what it means to have it in your head, but, to accept it and to get past the fear in that respect, whether philosophy helps or not. But the thing I want to ask you, since your mother's death, you mentioned being, we'll say, haunted by her in dreams for years. Any relief after the book?
Yes. After writing the book.
Yeah.
Certainly. I write about it towards the end. I had a dream where, for the first time, she wasn't behind bars or in a prison or behind dirty windows, desperately trying to communicate with me. I had a dream where she was joyfully singing in bright sunshine, singing her heart out. This amazing aria from Gluck, which is what Orfeo sings after he's realised he never will get Eurydice back. And it was a revelation. My psyche, this was, I don't believe in ghosts. My psyche had offered me the solution, which was that she had actually found some happiness and she had transcended it all. And once I realised that, my psyche stopped sending me my miserable mother. I mean, one of the real problems, though, this is important, is I did not go to her funeral.
Yeah, you mentioned that, and I wasn't sure about bringing that up. But since you brought it up,
I can't tell
problematic relationship, you said.
I can't tell you why not, because of
family.
That's my siblings.
Yeah.
My two brothers are still very sore about it. My sister and I both didn't go. That is not to do with my mother. That was to do with our father, who was a very difficult father of daughters. It wasn't what people immediately think these days. It wasn't sexual abuse of any kind of very specific form. It was not. I don't want his memory being in any way associated, but having a very, very patriarchal Christian father is tough for girls, right?
Yeah.
And we didn't go because of, well, actually, you know what? I'll tell you.
No one's listening. It's okay. I'm just kidding.
No, but why not? I think all these things are going to come out. There was a huge row when she was 3 months before she died, because she could have been allowed to die naturally, and that the men who are all Christians in my family, the three men, my two brothers and my father, outvoted my sister and me, and indeed the medical specialists, and insisted on surgery that she found that she could have been allowed to die peacefully at that point, and she wasn't, and she had a miserable last 3 months because of religious convictions. And my sister and I simply didn't get beyond that. But that was typical of the lack of real democracy, right? Sure. And then the funeral was put on a date when both she and I already had incredibly important commitments. I mean, some of the most important of our lives as it happened. And nobody asked whether we were available. And we were so angry at the lack of consultation from that we just decided not to go. But from my own point of view, this was a great mistake. I am quite convinced if I had seen her body being lowered into the furnace of the crematorium, I wouldn't have been haunted quite as badly. Having said that, I think it took finding out who the real Brenda Henderson was. You know, for the 35 years she was on the planet before I was probably more important to that. And this dream was quite amazing. And since then, I have dreamt about her, but they're completely different. I'm missing her sorely today. It's
Mother's Day for you, right?
It's Mother's Day for us, and I always want to send her flowers. And actually, something's come up at work. She used to help me a lot with preparation in a technical sense of manuscripts for publication. And I've got a sticky problem with a bibliography right now that needs to be another Yale University Press one, actually. Oh. But it needs to be solved very quickly. And you know what? She'd have just taken tomorrow off and done it. Yeah. She would. She really would. So I've been really missing my mother just today. But missing in a good way that appreciates her for what she was, not what she wasn't.
Yeah. When you bring up the way she indexed your books and her role as an indexer, I'm not sure if there's a more overt image for the role of, she helped organize my knowledge into a concise way of understanding things. I am glad you gave her an entry as indexer in the Absolutely. Index. I thought that was a nice...
And because, we were estranged a lot, the worst one of all, actually, after the birth of my last child, when she did not come to help, and she did exactly what her mother had done to her. But after that, it was about 4 years after that, she did the first index for me, or first in a very long time, rather. Yeah. And although we never, ever got intimate, there is a peculiar vicarious intimacy about phone calls, about semicolons. And so I think we both knew that it was a substitute for something more loving, right? The content was not about love. The content was about end dashes and alphabetization and how you cited British parliamentary acts. But the reciprocity and mutual helpfulness was love. It was true love. So, yes, I think your metaphor about she helped me organise my knowledge, and she did that after she died by leaving this great box. And she said Edith must have that. She did.
Yeah.
And actually my siblings didn't even want it. They don't have... Because they didn't have the same psychological experience in childhood, they didn't have the same... I have 3 siblings. None of them really wanted to do this research.
Are they... What's their response been to the work that you've done? To this book, I mean.
I haven't sent it to them yet.
Okay.
I'm meditating upon it.
I don't think any of them come off poorly by any means.
No, it's not that. What worries me is more the famous words of Queen Elizabeth about Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. Recollections may vary, I think is... Yeah. We all 4 had very different... Clearly, we're 4 different people, very, very, very different experiences of childhood. We're all very different people. I was the only one who openly rebelled. And recollections may indeed vary. So what I'm expecting is a very long list of corrections. That didn't happen, that did. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
It's not that I think they'll be particularly angry, though they probably would rather that, as they see it, dirty linen isn't washed in public. But I don't think that's the problem. My problem is the recollections may vary emails.
Yeah, I understand. Do you wish you had pushed her more?
Yes.
Or was that just unfeasible? Okay. So yeah, go on.
Yes, I do. One of the great issues, and I talk about this several times in the book, was that she cried all the time.
Yeah.
And the minute she started crying, I would back off. And looking back on it, I simply needed to tolerate the tears and say, this isn't good enough, Mum, right?
Yeah.
Depriving me of this knowledge. And I felt very angry when the first great photograph of my grandmother at Edinburgh University with all these men. You know, that would have, the amount of comfort that would have given me early in my career, when you can imagine Oxford University classics in the late 1970s and 1980s. I was almost invariably the only woman in a room. That is not the case anymore, but it certainly was then. And with all that goes with that, ranging from, just verbal innuendo to downright prejudice, to not getting jobs because I was a woman, all the way through. If I had been told about her going to Edinburgh and braving out this important committee and been shown that photograph, it would have given me an ancestral help, not an ancestral hindrance. So, yeah, I should have just let her cry and said, but this isn't good enough. I want a relationship with you, and you've got to tell me more about your mother.
I just, the sensation of her, like you say, facing down the Furies as though she's fighting a destiny to save you without.
I think she thought she was. Well, and in some ways, of course, she did. I am still here, but her idea, part of her way of facing down the Furies was utter silence, silencing, and that was, I think, unfortunate. And open conversations about all of this would have made it much easier to get beyond. I had to wait. I mean, for heaven's sake, girl, I'm 65 years old. Having to wait till I'm 62 to find out the truth about them all was, 60 years too long.
I can imagine. And that, as you mentioned, that implicit sense that you were somehow to blame for your grandmother's suicide. Again, I know your mother, from the way you describe it, doesn't explicitly blame you, but it's somehow tied into your very life. Yeah. My
birth, my naming, and as it happens, my inherited disposition and inherited looks. I'm the only dark-haired one. I look like my grandmother fairly obviously if you look at the photograph. Yeah. And she was the academic one in her family. She was the clever one. She was the one who went off to do English and Latin at university. And she was definitely depressive by genetic inheritance. And I was the one with all of that package. And she'd named me after her. And there is no doubt, I've done a lot of reading on this, that she, having her mother killed herself when I was just coming up to 4, it must have been absolutely impossible. The Inuit name their girl children after their dead mothers, right? Yeah. Because they think that it's the little mama come back again. My mother can not have failed to think something like that. So I was handed a script, even if I hadn't suffered from endogenous depression, which I certainly had by the age of 8. I mean, there was a breakdown when I was only 8 years old, and so on. But even if I hadn't had that, which, thank heavens, hooray, is entirely controllable by SSRIs, right? Yeah. I've had the benefit of drugs that simply weren't available to these ancestors, and they work miraculously on me. Really, I mean, if I go off them, I start crying every single day, right? I just cry. I'm so oversensitive and so over-empathetic. It is possible to be over-empathetic that you cannot walk down the street where there are homeless people on it because you're howling, right? Aristotle talks about people with exactly this excessive identification. Once I'm on the SSRIs, I can toughen up, get through a day without crying, go off and give a certain amount of money to a homeless charity, and then just walk down that street with the homeless people because I've given the money to the charity. So I have been saved by those. And as I say, hooray. But I've read a lot about this stuff. She did not have any help. Her mother killed herself. She had 3 children, of whom only one was still not at school with her all day, every day, who was called the same and who looked the same. I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination.
God. Yeah. When we talk about that sense of intergenerational trauma, and obviously the Greeks knew what they were talking about with these family curses, without dragging your kids into it, what did it mean to you as a mother?
Well, I say in the book, it took me many years of therapy in my 30s to take the plunge. I thought I couldn't. Every time, although I had a very strong urge to it, I was always wanted to be a mum. It took me many years of therapy with the most marvelous woman, and I'd like to name her. She's very elderly now, Julia Sleeper, in Oxford, and she managed to get me to talk myself into the position where because I was so aware of the dangers, was actually less likely than a lot of women to impose psychological stuff on my children. And that rational argument really sank in at some point, that parents who are very, very aware of the pitfalls that they're facing are far less likely to be bad parents. The penny just dropped at some point, and we were very lucky, Richard and I managed to, push children out without any problem at 39 and 41, which was marvellous. I'd also brought up his his daughter from a previous marriage. And I don't know, you really would have to ask them. But our policy has been perhaps an excess of openness, talk about everything. They sometimes say too much information.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of gone, I'm so anxious for them to not feel that things are being kept from them, because children are incredibly sharp. And even when they haven't guessed the right thing, that their emotional antennae are right out there. You're a parent. So there's no point. Oh, so I'm
not me. I'm a dog parent. I've avoided having children
you're a godparent and you're uncle.
Yeah, I'm an uncle, and I have a the family curse ends with me vibe when it came to having kids, because of looking at my parents and thinking,
really,
well, I don't want to subject them to any of this. My brother's done fine with 3 kids, but I just feel like there's or as my wife and I, when my wife and I first had this conversation before getting married, we didn't like kids even when we were kids. So, we stayed away from the whole side of it. But I get where you're.
Congratulate you. I think the worst thing in the world is people bringing unwanted children into the world. This is one of my, being a human is so hard already that if you then also have any doubts that you weren't wanted, which I did not have from my mother. I cannot say that. She never said such a thing.
Yeah.
She did say, "I wish you weren't so like my mother," repeatedly. But she never said, "But I don't want you."
Yeah.
And she was very proud of me towards the end. I know that my academic achievements did please her, and that's good to know.
And the sense, though, of really integrating your career and your life like this, finding all of those parallels, was it a sense that your life almost started paralleling the tragedies, as opposed to the tragedies being a nice set of guides for how you were responding to things?
That's a very interesting question. I think, some of the tragedies do end in total disaster, and they end with relatives howling after someone has died. But they're howling actually in a way that is helpful for us to look at, because they're very articulate about what this will mean for them in the future. I mean, these are very helpful scripts. But there's also the redemptive ones, and the great redemptive ones are the Heracles of Euripides and the Philoctetes of Sophocles, and up to a point, the Oresteia of Aeschylus, where we go from dreadful, repetitive violence to somebody somehow managing to transcend it and live on. So I definitely think that's the case with myself, that I went into a very dark abyss as a young adult, but came out of it and have never ever I mean, I still have suicidal ideation absolutely all the time, especially when under stress. But one of the most important sections in that book, I hope, is where I distinguish between the phenomenon of ideation and planning and execution, which simply isn't commonly made. People can't tell other people that they have these ideations because people are terrified that they're going to do it. In fact, what you need is to talk about the ideation.
Right.
That's when I've read that piece, I told my wife about it. I was like, and she's telling him, and I've only had 2 hours of sleep for the last 6 weeks because of this child. Oh, no. And and they took it as you're going to kill yourself and your kid. Yeah. I
read, as you said, there's a whole chapter on philosophy. One of my few serious talents, I think, is explaining very difficult philosophical ideas in a way people can relate to and understand. I think I'm good at that. So that's why I trace the entire history of philosophical responses to it.
Yeah.
So because we need that background, so that people still make those same arguments that David Hume did, or Locke did, or Rousseau did, or whatever. It's good. I think we needed that intellectual archaeology of it. Yeah. But we also need what the current thinking is. And I found the research on ideation revelatory, because it's there is hardly a human on the planet who hasn't imagined themselves jumping off a high building or jumping under a train or something. And
it's the veering into traffic thing. I years ago was talking to a coworker, and this coworker said, "Oh yeah, I think about that sometimes," and everybody glossed over it, and I just said, "Wait, just one thing. When you're like on a bridge, do you think of just veering off?" "Oh, all the time." I'm like, "Okay, just making sure that that's who you are and what you're thinking." And everybody in the room was just going silent. I'm like,
my husband is accelerating up to trees.
Now I'll tell you the flip side. I took my father to a medical. He had a bunch of medical stuff last summer. He's in his mid 80s, and we had to do the mental part of the forms we're filling out. And there was a question of how often do you feel life isn't worth living, and how often per week. And he just went silent and looked away from me. And I was like, just going to put down several times a week, Dad, gonna just check that out. Chances are they're not even going to look at it. But he just couldn't bring himself to say,
really,
that this is, and I know this is what he's going through. He's been for years because he's been in decline, but just can't bring himself to say, yes, I wish I was dead. And I was like, oh, okay. I mean, I know it, intellectually, even if we don't talk about this stuff, but I'll check off the box on the form, and that way at least there's some documentation somewhere. But
so you've had to think about it a lot in your own life and relationships.
In weird ways, more in the overall acceptance of death as opposed to suicide. Partly this was after this exchange with my brother this morning, telling my wife, I don't have these issues. She's like, I worry because you travel a lot for work and you're alone in hotel rooms, and there's the impulse thing. I'm like, no, I just don't have it. I get the burnout thing at the end of a long day at a trade show and sitting and staring at a wall for an hour. But at no point is it, that belt and that shower rod will work perfect. It never, crosses my mind in that sort of way.
Delighted to hear it. And
it's a weird trip, but like the mini images that you bring up, those things will flash into one's head, my head.
Well, I could not possibly do it. And that's one of the reasons I draw out. I'm very interested in all these philosophers' actual lives. And it was pretty shocking to me to discover that many of those who said we should be able, it's a human liberty, matter of human rights, or like the existentialists, it's the only rational response in the face of the absurdity of existence. These guys, they've almost all got hordes of children. They never talk about it, and they're almost always men. I do think there is a gender issue here, that women with children just have taken that responsibility historically much more seriously, and I haven't had the luxury to go around telling everybody that they're thinking about killing themselves, because it would freak their children out. Right. It seems to me that there are all these male philosophers. I mean, seriously, Rousseau put all his children in an orphanage.
Yeah.
David Hume's mother was left widowed with no money and 3 small children, and he talks about how marvelous she was. I've often wondered whether that exhausted woman didn't think, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to go to sleep forever?
But, and it's also, when women do this, it's seen as much worse than men. When
really
women do end it, because with men it's he was facing really tough times with a woman. How could she possibly do that? It's
yeah. Then it's sort of men. It can get a heroic aura, and that is a hangover, as I detail from Roman Stoicism. That they made an almost a cult of the guy who kills himself in the face of any sort of difficulty. So it got a heroic aura, which females committing suicide have never had. It's seen as desperate and needy and selfish. So I hope I bring that out a bit.
The book was revelatory for me in those ways, and just like I've been stressing, the way you integrate the tragedies into it. My reading of them, you touch on a bunch that I haven't gotten to, like Philoctetes and a couple I haven't read.
That Philoctetes, as we say in England, it doesn't really matter, but. Well, it's just so marvellous, because this is another setup. This is someone in excruciating pain whose career, life and work has been completely wrecked by being sadistically dumped in complete isolation on a desert island with an incurable, he thinks, leg wound, which causes him absolute agony, as gangrene does, apparently. Sure. I've read about gangrene, who receives from a totally unexpected direction a complete remission, right? He's still young enough to go off and go back to his job, which is being a very good archer, and help win the Trojan War and get to be healed. And it comes out from nowhere. And that is something so important. That is one of the arguments, that just because you think about like this now, can I show you what I think you could look like in 10 years' time? And this is so important for the young, that however desperate they think they feel, try to get them to see themselves in a happy home, with people who love them, and a fulfilling career in 10 years' time. And that's what that play Philoctetes gives us. Which
tragedies have changed the most for you?
How do you mean change? Changed me the most?
What changed from when you first read them? And I know reading them as a teenager is obviously, you're going to read them a lot differently at 65 than you're going to at 15. But, which ones really, I did not get this when I was 20-something, or when I was at Oxford. It took...
Well, I actually think, although I write about it as though, and I do believe it did help save my life, but Euripides' Heracles, I did not realise until now I'm looking back, 40 years later, I did not realise why it was so good. I hadn't read it in a sort of psychoanalytical way. I'd read it in a very emotional way, that, hey, this guy is saved, right, by his best friend and his adoptive father. It's his actual father is Zeus. It's not, neither of these men is related to him biologically. And that is a beautiful thing in itself, that they're celebrating the power of human friendships. But poor Heracles, halfway through the play, he's been sent psychotic by a jealous god, and has done absolutely nothing wrong. And Euripides is very, very clear. Sometimes Heracles has done wrong things in plays. This Heracles hasn't. And he comes back from Hades, and he's delighted to see his children. He hugs them. He's thrilled to see his wife. Then he goes indoors, goes mad, is sent mad, and kills them all. So when he comes round, even trying to imagine what it would be like to come round and discover that you've killed all those people you loved the most, right? On top of the disgrace, he's been Greece's top superhero. So he has nothing to live for. These people cannot be brought back from the dead. And yet, these two other men, over a period of nearly an hour, go through all the right moves, right? Every single right statement, including, we're not going to leave you alone for a minute, so don't even think about it. They say that, we are not leaving your side. We are staying right beside you. Come away and live with me in Athens. Let's get away from here, says Theseus. I will look after you for the rest of your life, right? Think about all the things you've done for Greece. How will the Greeks feel if their great superhero gives up just because he's in a very bad emotional situation? How will they all feel, right? You have got a great reputation. They are going to forgive you for this because you have done so much. And then one of the key arguments Theseus actually says to him is, do you know what real courage is, Heracles? It's not strangling lions of Nemea, right? It's not arresting fire-breathing bulls. It's going on living, enduring life, however painful, for a better cause, which is the fact that you're an example to everybody and lots of people still love you. That is true courage. So he puts carrying on living in terms of what Heracles actually wants, right? It's incredibly clever. And I would like, as I say, that particular half of that play, I think should be in the training of every suicide therapist in the world. And I didn't realise at the time. It cheered me up and helped me to go on living, but I didn't realise how intellectually refined and psychoanalytically refined it was. The other example is not really about suicide, but so in Aeschylus' Agamemnon, Clytemnestra kills her husband because 10 years previously he'd sacrificed their daughter.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I never really emoted on either side until I had my first daughter. Okay. Once I'd had my, first pregnancy, produced this adorable little girl with this man who I live with, if he had touched a hair on her head, right, I feel the Chicago musical song, He Had It Coming on.
Yeah.
Given that she had absolutely no legal mechanism available, as she said very, very clearly, she says that to chorus, that there was no law court for me. The law courts had not been founded yet. They're founded two plays after that.
Yeah, because of her assassination or murder. But yeah.
I do not think I could have left my husband alive on the planet if he killed that baby. Right. I mean, I know that sounds probably shocking, but yes, that my own becoming a mother radically transformed my opinion of that play.
Yeah, I think of these things in terms of, for me, the barometer was the fourth time through the Iliad when I was in my 40s.
Oh, really?
As opposed to in my 20s. And it was the first time Achilles' son meant something to me. The reference about never seeing his son or his father again, I suddenly had Achilles isn't a giant douchebag. He's the guy he's the only one who knows what's going to happen, and he knows what he has to sacrifice.
Yeah.
But he's really giving something up while the rest of them are
It's very moving, isn't it? It's incredibly moving. He has got an alternative life back in Thessaly. But then he hasn't because Patroclus dies and he cannot control his rage about that. But he did have an alternative, which he renounced.
My brother contends it's a redaction in the text, but the part in, I think, Book 9, where he reveals that he knows his fate to Odysseus, and Odysseus goes back and relates the entire speech except for the part about his fate. I like to read that as the rest of them can't even understand Achilles.
Can I just absolutely they can't, because he's half immortal and he's got knowledge.
He can see the strings. They can't see the strings, and he's so alienated from everyone. It didn't occur to me until my 40s when I was getting pretty deep into alienation at that point. But it was just that sense of.
Can I just say a word about this redaction thing for you to say to your brother?
Yep. The
Iliad came into being over a period of at least 800 years.
Sure.
Right. It had multiple people embroidering it. The fact is that it came into being in the shape precisely almost that we've got it because it was regarded as perfect at that point. Now, so what if it was one of the later rhapsodes who put those lines in, right? That doesn't matter because it's the collective product of 8 centuries of Greek sensibility. So anybody who starts saying it's an interpolation or it shouldn't be there or we should delete it, that bit, just say, Professor Hall says this argument doesn't stack up.
I'm zapping my brother about this, and I hope it doesn't push him over the edge because, like I say, we talked about some of this stuff. But it was actually, and I'm going to go with Alcestis for the pronunciation, although he says Alcestis should be on the antepenult. But I said, I think
England
it's...
we say Alcestis. It really doesn't matter.
Okay, because that was my moment of like, boy, Google saying it's a S sound. I think it's a hard okay. But yeah,
It is. For some reason, we took that one over from the French, who say Alceste.
I do thank you for bringing that into this book, because it is one of the most weirdly confounding.
Isn't it?
It's not a tragedy. And that's the weirdest thing about it. It becomes a comedy at the end. And I'm like, I don't think this is, well, again, Aristotle puts a framework on some of these things, but Euripides just made something grander than any schema that was in place. But you make it such a beautiful reading.
I think it still is a tragedy, and I say why.
Yeah.
Because so she dies in place of her husband. It's elective death. Some people don't say it's not suicide, but it's elective death, despite her two little children weeping all over her.
Yeah.
But she's brought back from the dead by Heracles, and that's where it all becomes rather burlesque and farcical and supernatural. But her husband, who has promised her in her dying moments never to remarry, right? Because she's so frightened about what a stepmother might do to her children. He has promised her within, less than a day after she dies, when she's brought veiled, and Heracles says, "Do you fancy this one?" He says, "Yes, I'll marry her." New bride. Now, that to me sets up a total tragedy for that family, right? Those children had gone through the most terrible day in which they lost and then regained their mother. And she knows that he had broken that most important of oaths about looking after their children within a day of her death. Now, how is that going to be a happy family?
Right. And that's part of a reading I had not put on it all those years, because I took it as everything up until then, which was basically Heracles arm wrestles death to get the wife back, but also that it's Admetus's hospitality that turns out to be the redeeming thing, that he's trying to make Heracles happy and hide his own grief, and that's what inspires Heracles to go off and wrestle death. And he's trying to be nice to Heracles by accepting the wife, but I prefer your really, really
it depends whether
dark
you
reading
think
much
about
more.
it from Alcestis' point of view or her husband's point of view.
Yeah.
If you imagine going down to Hades, coming back, and then finding that he's already broken that promise.
And I think this is the difference between a man reading that play and a woman reading that play.
Yes.
So Iliad or Odyssey?
Iliad.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I've written a whole book, as you probably know, about why the Odyssey is as brilliant as it is. It's the mother of all stories. It's a revenge plot. It's a romance. It's a travelogue. It's science fiction, right? It's all of those things. But the Iliad is the one that really, really grapples with the human condition. In a deadly series where there's actually not much supernatural. I know there are gods, but there aren't shapeshifters and magicians and giants. And it is about the fact that we're all going to die, and death is horrible, as Achilles says. Actually, in the Odyssey to Odysseus, I would rather be the merest serf, day labourer alive on planet Earth than the king of all the world in Hades. Yeah. So it is the great human condition poem, and almost every kind of relationship, man, wife, parent, child, is explored in all the pain that bereavement brings. It's a masterpiece. It's also not goodies and baddies, unlike the Odyssey. The Odyssey's about good Odysseus versus either bad monsters or bad suitors. The Iliad is quite properly about regular people who are neither good nor bad, engaged in a 10-year-long vicious death-bringing war. And it's the fact that the Trojans are absolutely the moral equals of the Greeks that gives it its great humane power.
I thank you very much for that too. I've always been an Iliad guy, and it's always tough to say, well, I get the Odyssey, but to me, the greatest part of the Odyssey is that moment when he goes into the underworld. And
well, my next Yale University Press book, which is the one I'm battling over the bibliography, it's coming out this time next year, and it is finally my book on the Iliad. So.
Oh, good. I do hope we can get back together to sit down again for this. And if you're ever going to be in the New York, New Jersey world, But I do want to ask, is there a play that you wish had survived? Is there one you think, boy, it would have been great to have read something that was referenced. I get it more with Aristotle or with the other philosophers. But yeah.
It's a really, really good question. I think it would have to be the Prometheus Unbound. We have Prometheus Bound, which may or may not be by Aeschylus, but it's one of the greatest plays of all time, and it's where the great Titan, who's rebelled against the very tyrannical Zeus, is punishment is made worse. He's about to be sent beneath the rocks of the Caucasus to be further tortured for another, dozen millennia or whatever. But in the Prometheus Unbound, we know that he was freed, and at some point, either in that play or the third one, I want the rest of the Prometheus trilogy, he came to a compact with Zeus. He forced Zeus into some sort of compromise that made the human condition rather better, right? Because he'd been punished for giving humans fire. Yeah. And I want to know very much
how that argument went,
how it happened, and what the content of the new, better compact was.
Man, it puts me in mind of that the Stoppard play Arcadia, with all those works that fall by the wayside over time, and the possibility that they're going to be reconstituted somehow someday. But yeah.
Well, in fact, it's pretty clear that the play I want was informed by the ideas of the philosopher called Protagoras, who was the first great theorist of democracy. And we haven't got his text, but we know that he provided the political theory for the Athenian democracy. And one of his central ideas was consensus, that you've got to achieve a belief system that you all share in. And that has got to include the working class. We know that that's what he did. He was also one of the first great agnostics. He said that we've no idea why we're here, so we better get on with taking responsibility for it while we're here. We haven't got this man. We have not got Protagoras. And good heavens, don't we need the first great theorist of democracy and consensus politics right now?
Yeah, I hear you.
Don't we need him?
Final question, because we just hit the hour mark, which I always feel bad about eating somebody's Sunday afternoon. And I should have warned you this was coming. Who are you reading, or what have you been reading?
Okay, I have been reading. Just let me get the exact details. Sorry, it's right
No
here.
worries. Some people have some people are recording from their bedrooms and they have the whole stack on their nightstand. But
okay, I have been reading Eric Williams, Capitalism and Slavery. It doesn't sound particularly light, but it's not. But I'm writing about history of justifications for slavery in Aristotle, and this is absolutely enthralling. So this book is written, this is what I was trying to check, 50 years ago at least, and it's by a great black political theorist who brilliantly shows that sort of biological racism was not inevitable at all. It's not natural. It came about because of the needs of capital.
Yeah.
And he argues in very great detail, but that also explains why it's proving so incredibly difficult to get rid of that kind of racism, because for 400 years, people had to be convinced that people from Africa were biologically inferior, right? That was necessary for them to remotely stomach slavery. Now, how are you going to change an ideology that has been rammed down people's throats for centuries in only the century and a half since abolition, right? So it's so measured compared with a lot of stuff that's written today with identity politics and on race, and it is so brilliantly researched. But it's also kind of hopeful in the end, because if this was a social construct that came around contingently, it can equally well be a social construct that is deconstructed for the needs of a modern world. So that sounds very heavy, but that is what I've been reading.
No, at 1944, by the way, according to Wikipedia, published in the US in 44.
Ago.
Yeah.
But I think it's the best book I've ever read in terms of explaining one of the great obscenities of human history.
So I'll leave you with that. Okay, that's a strong one to finish a show. I guess moving from suicide to slavery, it's one of those.
Sorry about that. I'm actually quite a funny person, I promise you.
I'm enjoying the conversation, but I figure we'll gab more off mic and lighten up a little bit. But good Lord, this has been a very good hour and something I'm awfully happy. When you mentioned, by the way, being enthralled by a book, I started Aristotle's Way earlier this week after finishing Facing Down the Furies. I'm only 100 pages in, and it's very rare that I keep going with a guest after finishing their session because I've got so much more to read.
Of course you do.
But yes, I will be continuing with Aristotle's Way for the next few days before jumping into the reading Shakespeare, reading me memoir for my next guest. So,
the one thing I would say is that I only write books when I really, really mean them. Both these books came from a place of absolute conviction that these things need to be talked about.
I think I'm enjoying the heck out of this one. I'm so glad. Just going over the Yale University Press catalog and seeing the title for Facing Down the Furies, I thought there might not be a more suitable book for me to sit down with the author for a show. So I'm awfully glad this came together, Edith.
Well, I'm very grateful to you for inviting me on.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And that was Edith Hall. Her new book, Facing Down the Furies, is fantastic and it's important. And I hope you'll give it a read. It's from Yale University Press. And you should also check out Aristotle's Way, Edith's previous book, which we talked about here. You don't have to have a classics background. You don't have to have that for either of these. She makes these ancient works accessible. And there's an awful lot of good stuff in both of those books. In Aristotle's Way, there's a lot about how to live better and how to treat others better. And Facing Down the Furies is how to treat yourself better and how to rely on other people to help you through the toughest time. And you should also visit Edith's site, which is edithhall.co.uk, for a lot more of her writing, interviews, articles, all sorts of stuff she's done. As you can tell from our conversation, she's got a great presence, and her work is fascinating. It's important. She brings the ancient world to life and shows that we're not that different. And she's also on Twitter as Edith May Hall, all one word. So follow her there if you're still on that platform. I'll have links to all this in the show and episode notes for this one. And I'm sorry for talking on and on about my thing. I think she's right that we do need to destigmatize suicide in order to help stop it. And I'm really freaked out by my brother's admission about his own episode. When we were corresponding and when we talked a few days later, I did talk to him about maybe getting therapy, but he contends that his 40-mile bike rides are his form of therapy. I told him that is almost literally racing away from the problem. We agreed to disagree on that. He did say that if things get severe, I would be the first person he calls. The first venue that he would go to is, of course, Biking Harder, which, anyway, we'll see where all that goes. Thank you for listening to this one. Okay.